Okay, let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Blockchain Research Institute's webinar series. Today, we are doing part two of our series on identity, this one focused on identity and financial services. And we're very delighted to welcome two people who can speak quite authoritatively on the matter. The first is Fatima Perrone, the Senior Director of Enterprise Innovation at CIBC. And our other guest today is Andre Boyson, the Chief Identity Officer of SecureKey, also based here in Toronto. This is going to be a wide-ranging discussion where we're going to cover lots of different aspects of identity. In Blockchain Revolution, we covered the financial services industry and identified identity is actually one of the 8 key pillars of what the industry actually does. Without a way to prove who you are, you can't get access to basic financial services. And so the act of doing accreditation and attestation of individuals, businesses, and other entities is actually critical to making the financial services system work. But what we saw in the world as it existed in the past was something that was somewhat antiquated. And now we finally have technology solutions that can provide an answer to some of those problems. So we're going to have a nice wide-ranging discussion, but let me first say thank you to our guests, Fatima and Andre, for joining us today. Thanks for being on the webinar.
Thanks, Alex.
Okay, Andre, I'm going to put it to you first. Identity in financial services, what's the problem today, as you see it?
The problem we have in identity is that we've got 2 problems. Each of us on the call here has an interest in getting access to services that we want to get online. And then for all the service delivery organizations, which I'm sure there's a lot of representation on the call as well, you have a challenge is you've got to enroll, the mission is actually quite simple. Let customers in, keep crooks out. But implementing the mission, it turns out to be quite complicated because we have to bring consumers along in the story. And what we find in today's economy is the crooks are good at it. And each of us as everyday consumers are not.
Okay, so Verify.me then. This is a solution that was created by SecureKey. It's been a few years in the works. I remember hearing about this from your CEO, Greg Wolfon, a couple of years ago, and it went live in May of 2019, this year. So tell us, what is Verify.me? How does that work?
Maybe I'm going to just start a little bit earlier than that to explain how we got here. In 2012, we launched a service called Concierge. And Concierge was focused initially only at the federal government, allowed Canadians to get access to federal services online. And the challenge the government of Canada had back in 2012 is like every other service delivery organization on the planet, they issued user IDs and passwords. And the challenge for me, the consumer, is when I went to CRA or any other online federal service, I hadn't been there for a year. When I came, I forgot the password every single time. And so the challenge for the government is they can't do what Amazon does. They can't do an email password reset. They have to do something more rigorous. They actually have to send something to your house by secure mail. And you get this thing 2 weeks later, you're supposed to type it back into the internet. That cost them, by my calculation, about $40 a shot. And so for the period 2004 to 2012, the government of Canada spent $970 million authenticating 5 million Canadians. And it's not the case that the government didn't understand the internet. The government understood the internet really, really well, actually. The problem was all of us couldn't remember the darn password. And so when we launched the service Concierge in 2012, the win for the government of Canada was huge. Their cost came from $970 million down to roughly $200 million. And the number of Canadians transacting online increased. And most importantly of all, their integrity increased. When I go to CRA and I can't get in, my conclusion is I forgot. And most of the time, that's actually the truth. I forgot. But in a small set of circumstances where a crook took over the account, I don't tell anybody because I think I forgot. Contrast that with CIBC. When I can't get into my CIBC account, I know I didn't forget. I was in there 5 times last week. More importantly, I'm on DEFCON 5. I'm terrified the crook is spending my money. So I run down to CIBC right away to get that fixed. That increases integrity dramatically. And so the government of Canada has benefited from this. So the biggest challenge we had with Concierge was authentication only. It was a safe replacement for user IDs and passwords. And as we tried to take it to other places in the economy, they said, until you tell me it's Andre in the first visit, I can't use it. And so every service delivery organization on the planet needs to solve the 3 R's of service delivery. You need to do registration on the first visit, you need to be doing regular authentication, and you got to be able to do recovery. So what Verify.me does expands over Concierge by doing full customer IAM management that works across the economy. And the reason blockchain is in all of this is because Concierge was based on a broker model. Now, with the broker model, we implemented this triple blind concept, which says when I use my CIBC account to get to CRA, CIBC doesn't get to see my online destination. CRA knows I came from a tier 1 bank in Canada, but not which one. And then our company, which operates the network, we don't know who you are. So triple blind says nobody got a complete picture of the user transaction. So for our authentication, that worked fine. But as soon as we got to identity, if we had a broker in the middle was going to get to see a lot. And so blockchain gave us a method to implement triple blind identity in a way that's never been done across the economy.
So Fatima, Andre's talking about how this would be very helpful for CRA because there's so much data that CIBC as a bank collect about a consumer, and individuals are constantly interacting with that. So I can see the benefit to a lighter touch organization like the government being a part of this kind of a network. What's the benefit to CIBC as you see it? Like, why does CIBC want to be part of this initiative?
So there's several factors of why CIBC was sort of interested to be part of this initiative from the get-go. One of it is it's actually a unique opportunity for us to shape client experience in a digital world. When you look at some of the challenges that Andre was talking about for consumers, when it comes to both authentication and EID, authentication being their username and password when they're trying to access something, or EID being that they need to prove who they are when they're signing up for new products and services, they're really fragmented. Any given Canadian today has upwards of 96 accounts associated with one single email address and has to go through somewhere in the realm of 70 password resets per year. And different organizations have different standards on how they manage those passwords, etc. And so when even clients can actually start an application online, they're normally driven to another channel for fulfillment. So you're starting a banking application online, we need to validate your ID, now you have to come into the branch. You can look at something like password renewals, now you're going to make all these photocopies of your ID information and mail it in. So what this fragmented experience really does is creates risk, not just for banking consumers, but for Canadians overall in terms of fraud and data breach. And so end of the day, we have an opportunity to shape what this identity solution will look like, give clients the full control, have the right level of security and privacy, and really implemented it across industries. So we're strengthening the Canadian economy overall. So we thought that was really exciting. Us as an FI, we are definitely viewed as custodians of data for our consumers. So knowing that this risk exists for our consumers as they're interacting with other organizations, we did feel strongly that we have a role to play to fix that.
Okay, so using verified.me though, I would be able to basically take all the attestations that you've done, all the work that you've done, all the money that you've spent, and then go to TD Bank or RBC and open up a bank account like that, right? So it actually lowers the barrier for me to do business with one of your competitors. Right. So that's the trade-off, I guess, that you're making. And what I find really fascinating about this is that in many respects, you've figured out that it makes more sense, it's more valuable to you and your consumer experience to collaborate with your biggest competitors than it is to operate inside of a silo. So what was the journey to get to that point? How long did it take to convince your colleagues or your bosses or whatever of the the value of this type of collaboration?
It's an interesting question. It took us a long time. As you kind of alluded to, we've been talking about Verified Me for years, and it took us almost 3 years to implement. So I would say 2 of those years was probably done a lot of convincing. You can imagine having 7 banks having their lawyers, representatives trying to negotiate all these terms.
Sounds like a nightmare.
It was. I still dream about it sometimes. However, end of the day, I think that's exactly kind of where we got to. As CIBC specifically, as an FI, I don't think we want to be in a position where we are holding our customers hostage because we don't want to participate with a solution that allows them to use actually their information. It's not ours, it's actually the consumer information, so they can switch banks. If that's what they really want to do, they should be able to do so. End of the day, it makes us stronger as a collective FIs if we all participate in this ecosystem versus we do not. I do think it still gives us some opportunity to do some unique things in the end where we can differentiate ourselves by providing services in a different way than we do today. And I think that's where we will have to concentrate on.
Okay, great.
Alex, can I just add to that? Because
yeah, sure.
I made some important points, so I just want to add some additional color. So the first point is, Fatima already said, is if I have a CIBC customer and I've decided I want to go get a loan at another bank for whatever reason, I've already made that choice, right? So the second thing is all of the banks have a mutual interest of backstopping fraud. I'm a CIBC customer, and so the crooks don't try to pretend to be me at CIBC because they know me well. They go to all the other banks where I don't have a relationship, and those banks can be more easily tricked because they don't know who I am. So the real value, however, is now, banks already provide the umbrella of trust when it comes to payment. When I want to go pay for something with debit or credit, the bank is there to help me and the merchant navigate trust. So the opportunity for the banks is today, payment's the very last thing I do in a transaction. The opportunity is to provide that same umbrella of trust when I do identity. And what's interesting is identity is always the first thing I do in transactions. And so it allows the bank to continue on their trusted brand to provide more value to consumers. And ultimately, that's going to come back in the form of a strong relationship.
Is there any way to quantify, this is a question to both of you, is there any way to quantify the reduction of harm and fraud that would occur from having verified.me? I mean, was that part of your calculus in pitching the banks on why this is a good solution, Andre?
Yeah, let me just add this. So we only do the easy stuff on the internet today. We don't do the hard stuff. I can't get a new bank account. I can't register to vote. I can't get a new car loan. I can't see my kids' education records. I can't see my healthcare stuff. We don't do the hard stuff on the internet because it's too risky. So for the hard stuff today, we force people to come to the counter on the first visit. And it doesn't matter what industry you're in, bank, telco, government, insurance, whatever, counter visits are expensive. They typically take 20 to 30 minutes. So if you're going to have a counter agent spend 20 or 30 minutes with me, that's going to cost you 50 or 60 bucks. And with Verified Me now, we can take that cost down to, depending on how much information you need, to sub $10 and even sub $5. So for the service delivery organizations, their costs come down dramatically, just like it did for the government of Canada. More importantly, the integrity is much higher. When I bring a driver's license into a new bank, the crook has the bank has no idea if it's a real driver's license or a fake one. They're susceptible to the fake driver's license attack. With our network, the data is real all the time. So in addition to bringing costs down, the integrity is much higher because it's checked against the source in real time.
Terrific. That's very helpful. You mentioned elections and voting, and that's something I want to table for later because we're going to talk about how the concept of digital identity is not confined to financial services. It's something that, and you already alluded to your interactions with the federal government, but it's something that affects your interactions with every kind of company and entity on the internet, basically. So we're gonna get to that in just a second. Let's talk specifically to the technology challenges of turning over an existing system into a new system. So there's an old joke that God may have invented the world in 6 days, but he didn't have an installed base. And banks,
but I love it.
Yeah, well, thank you. I'm here all week, trying the field. So banks like CIBC and Toronto Dominion and the Bank of Montreal and the Royal Bank of Canada, these are institutions that are 100 years old or more. And we know that a lot of the systems that financial institutions use to do all sorts of stuff are pretty old. It's not that they don't have to work fast; they just have to work all the time, even if they don't work all that well, right? And so we're talking now about a wholesale change in how we think about signing up new customers, verifying identity, reducing fraud, reducing money laundering, doing all the sort of soup to nuts KYC. So how challenging was that? Well, I'll ask you both the question. So you, by the way, Andre, do you think of yourself sort of as a vendor then to the banks?
We're trying to create a service that works for consumers, and it's ultimately about solving the problem for all three. We need to
talk about solving that problem then. Like, what were the actual implementation challenges that you needed to overcome?
So the biggest challenge is actually change. Nobody, consumers, destinations, and even sources of data don't like change. So that's just normal human nature. And so what you have to do is, solve the innovation paradox. Everybody's too busy to innovate. And so let me just talk about a parallel that kind of is very relevant to this kind of change we're trying to make now. Back in 1869, we did not have an electrical grid. We had generators, however, so we could generate electricity. And the reason we had generators because we wanted a light bulb so we could run 2 shifts. So electricity wasn't about electricity, it was about running a light bulb so you could run 2 shifts and get more throughput and productivity. So in 1870, the electrical grid was introduced, and there was a big effort to get companies to join the grid. What's interesting at the time is there were different reactions to this idea of joining a grid. There's 2 versions of yes and 2 versions of no. The first version of the yes was somebody like Fatima. She had a smaller factory and she couldn't afford a generator. So, joining the grid was an easy yes. I'm going to join because I can run 2 shifts, get more products, compete with the big guys. I'm in. The second version of the yes maybe was someone like you, Alex. You might say, you know what? I have a generator, but I hate the stupid thing. It's a distraction of my business and the thing's always breaking down. I want it out of here. I want to make products. I don't want to run a generator. So you join too. The first version of no was somebody who kind of said, you know what? I just bought my generator. Come and see me in 15 years. And then the second version of no was somebody like me. It's like, you know what? I like my generator. I don't want anybody between me and my factory. I hate your idea. Get out of here. What happened in the end is actually quite interesting. Everybody joined the grid. What's even more compelling is once we had cheap, abundant, and reliable electricity, everybody joined the grid and we started using it for everything. It was refrigeration now and heating and everything. So the reason I'm telling you this story is we're at that exact point in identity today. Every web service on the planet is running its own digital identity generator. What's interesting is we go sell this service out to the economy, we're getting 2 versions of yes and 2 versions of no. What's even more interesting is once we know we have cheap, abundant, reliable identity, it's going to change the economy in ways we never thought of. And so that's kind of the arc that we're on to make this change. Some organizations are going to resist, some are going to join right away. In the end, everybody's going to join. We're going to have a much better economy.
Cheap, reliable, abundant identity. That's a very interesting analogy, and it's useful too, because in the same way that the more people are connected to the electrical grid, the more useful electricity becomes. The more people connect to this digital identity, the more useful it becomes. Fatima here is the only one using Verified Me. It's useful in a way, but it's not as useful as if others are using it as well. And I think that's true largely of a lot of technologies, and especially financial technologies, which is that, the network effects multiply their usefulness as more and more, people and institutions and companies get connected to it. So from your side, what were the implementation challenges of getting on to this type of a platform?
And we're still going through some of them, to be blatantly honest.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be a longer journey than we initially anticipated. I always say it's a marathon, not a sprint. But initially, when setting up the whole service, it required us to have immense amount of focus on things like info security, what the technology would actually look like, where the hands-off are, what the privacy concerns are, and how do we address them, etc. I think one of the things when I look at digital identity and what Verified Me will be able to solve for us is anytime I have a conversation with any single line of business internally, they're always trying to solve 2 problems. One is authentication. How do we ensure that the right people are accessing their products and services? 2 is around how do we actually do the AML KYC in a digital way when they're signing up for products and services. And there's actually a lot of different providers out there who are doing very interesting things, and they call themselves digital identity. Things like biometrics, or even your vein reading and facial recognition. All of those are sort of what's, and how they're actually implemented is quite important. So let me walk you through an example. You walk into a banking center and you're able to use a facial recognition tool in order to identify yourself, and you get to access. But then you find out that digital copies of your facial recognition is stored in some cloud up in Russia. And let's say that same bank is now Russia. I pick Russia. You can also pick any other country, China, it doesn't matter. And then you may also find out that that same banking center is now also being able to sell that information to advertisers. That's not really digital identity. That's really, there was something cool out there, we implemented it, it gave us access. But if you're doing true digital identity, it matters how it's done. Client needs to be in control of it. It shouldn't be stored in some cloud. No one else should have access to those points. Verified Me kind of gives us that, right? It allows us to have this platform where client gets to see exactly what attributes is available, choose where it's going to go, what it's being able to be used for. And I think one of the coolest things of this factor is if I only need to know how old you are, I don't need your date of birth. I only need to know from a trusted source that yes, you're age majority. So I think taking Verified Me and really helping our line of businesses realize that this is how you should implement digital identity in a way that we protect our client, that we don't only solve the problem that we're facing, we're actually thinking of the long-term picture, is really what we're trying to overcome. It's a journey.
So this is a great segue, because I think if you're listening to this webinar, watching this webinar, you may wonder, well, what are the privacy implications of this? I mean, you know, are institutions sharing information about me with my consent, without my consent? How much information is being shared? But what you alluded to is not so much the data itself, but sort of a proof of the data, right? So if you need to buy beer at the beer store, they need to know you're 19. They don't need to know your date of birth, your address, or anything like that. And the same would apply for opening a bank account, voting, all sorts of other examples of the usage of identity. So, Andre, let's talk about that for a second. With Verified Me, if I have an account at CIBC and I use Verified Me and I go to open an account at Desjardins to get an insurance policy, and they're also a member of those, how much are they seeing all of the information that CIBC collected, or just a proof of that information?
It's probably, sorry, Andre, I'm going to jump in because it's not the best example, because that's a regulatory requirement where you actually have to receive the information when it's a bank account open. But if you pick something different,
so let's pick something different.
Andre, do you have an example of where they don't actually require the actual information, but a proof is sent?
What about getting a cell phone plan, Andre? Would that work?
Yeah, a cell phone plan is a great example.
Okay.
So I want to weave actually several threads together. I got a good question in the chat room here, so I want to bring that into the discussion. And so the first question is, well, please tell me, please tell me you're not putting all of this data on a blockchain. And so the short answer is no, we're not doing that. Blockchain is being used for three very specific purposes. One is that we're using it as a method to implement our triple blind protocol for identity. So when I share my data from A to B, A doesn't know where I sent it, B doesn't know where it came from, and the network operator, us, we can't see your data at rest or in motion. So that's the first thing we got from blockchain. The second thing we got from blockchain is integrity proofs. I already talked about the integrity challenge we have at the counter today. CIBC can't verify, the counter agent who works in Toronto can't verify the BC driver's license Andre brings when he comes to open a bank account. So they're defenseless against the bank account or the fake driver's license attack. They do a lot of checks and they don't get fooled often, but they get fooled sometimes, right? And so what this does is solve the integrity challenge. We can verify against the source that this is the valid driver's license information for Andre Boyson, and get the valid reference photo for Andre Boyson, which they can't do today. Today, if the crook takes my data, puts a fake photo on it, in some places it will pass. But the third thing is, first and foremost, Secure Key is a private engineering firm. We care about you, the user. So we've got this triple blind model, but the other thing we've done, and the team's already touched on this a couple of times, we do privacy mediation for you. We pre-negotiate with the destination service you want to go to about what data they're going to get. So the bar will only get a verification that you are over 19 and a green box around your photo if you are 19. And if I want to get a cell phone plan, they may want to verify my name and my address and maybe my bank account details if I'm trying to do this on a direct debit plan, maybe. So we only allow the destination to get the data that they're entitled to, and we pre-negotiate this for the user. We call that privacy mediation. There's no other service on the planet that does that. And if it protects you, the user. And we see this in the payment model too. In the payment model, when I go to Starbucks and I tap my card, I know the barista cannot change $5 to $50 after I leave. So we provide these protections in the payment model, and we want to do the same kind of thing in identity.
Okay. Just seeing some more questions coming in on the Q&A. So let's transition then into this question of open banking, and I'm sure both of you see this in the chat. So Anna asks, how does a project like Verified Me lend itself to the broader goal of open banking? So who wants to just take a shot at defining what we mean by open banking first?
Do you want to start or should I?
You go ahead. I'll jump in after you.
Okay. So the first thing I want to say is that, open banking is thrown around like it's a commonly understood term, and it's not. The way each country is doing it is actually slightly different. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is you actually can't do open banking without digital identity to support it. Let me just give you an example. I'm a customer, and Alex, you're the CEO of a new fintech, and CIBC is my bank. And so I need some way to prove or give you permission, Alex, to get my data from CIBC. How are you going to do this without strong digital identity? You're going to show up at CIBC and say, Andre said I can have his data. And they're going to say, prove it. And then what are you going to give? So that's one problem. The second problem is open banking, as realized in most countries around the world, is actually over-answering the question. If open banking means open banking, you give a carte blanche to all of the data forever. Right. You have no controls once you've given over the data, which is terrifying. We should allow the users to be selectively share data, and not have these all or nothing propositions. And the third thing I would say, if we're going to do open banking well, we should copy the Australian model. There's one thing in their provision that I don't see anywhere else, which I think is really powerful. They have this concept of reciprocity. And it was designed to stop asset stripping. They didn't want fintech sucking all the bank data out and then not giving the consumers the power to take the data from the fintech to somewhere else. So one of the preconditions for participating in open banking in Australia is if you want to get data, you agree your consumer, your customer can take the data elsewhere if they so choose.
Makes sense. So this is
let's get the team in because I want to hear this. What CIBC wants to say about this.
Yeah. We're very aligned to some of the points that you brought up, Andre. I also like the Australian model quite a bit for that reason of responsibility, but also because they are truly actually adopting something called consumer rights, so consumer data rights. They're looking at that consumers actually own their data and they should be able to control where it goes, provide consent, and know very explicitly how it's being utilized. It's in one of the more interesting models. I think Verified Me is a great example of open banking. We've created a platform that is allowing clients to go in and take their data, whichever data that is, and use it however it serves them right. That's the whole underlying premise behind open banking, is to allow consumers to access net new services that may be available for them that they need their own data for. It's very important on how we implement it, and I think Canada is in a unique position right now to do it right. We have a lot of models to learn from and ensure that we are actually really doing what we're saying that we want to achieve, which is putting the consumer in the middle. I do think it would be very dangerous if we don't look at the full model and ensuring that it's not just financial data that we are looking at. Consumers should probably want access to other information, like Google has really interesting information. Why shouldn't that be available? So it'd be interesting to see how it rolls out.
Well, that's another interesting point, which is that the data that financial services firms collect about consumers isn't necessarily the best data to, prove someone's creditworthiness, for example. I read a study that you'd be better off lending to people based on what their eBay, seller rating or their Uber rating is versus what their credit rating is. Because ultimately you're looking for, what's the expectation of a person's going to abide by their commitments, act with integrity, that they're going to do the right thing. And it turns out that there's all this data that's out there that firms frankly don't capture. But on the other hand, we don't want all of this information, which is already frankly overexposed, being shared willy-nilly. And so to me, I've always thought about this question of open banking as one where, yes, it's great if you can share this information with other institutions so that you can get better choice or maybe better pricing, but at the expense of your privacy, it's not worth it. So what I'm hearing from this is that really the only solution to open banking is one where you have a Verified Me type solution that sits over top of it, which I think is good that you're doing it, Fatima, and good for you, Andre, for making it happen.
It's cheers to Canada, because we're doing something here that's not helping, not happening anywhere else in the world. And so we've got a level of collaboration in the country that doesn't really exist in many other places. And so this is a Canada story. Well,
that's actually a great segue. So we have 5 banks, 6 if you want to include National Bank.
7
with CWB and whatever, there's more. But there are 5 big banks in this country. Is it harder or easier to do this with 5 banks or in a more fragmented banking environment, like say in the United States, where there are lots of different banks?
Fatima, why don't you start and then I'll follow up?
Sure. I actually think the fact that we have a concentrated financial industry in Canada has helped us roll out this digital identity solution. I know, Andre, you guys are working on the States, you may have a different view. But we are actually able to roll out something that really touches the whole population of Canada, and we're able to provide the services to everyone. I think in a fragmented market, getting that collaboration and finding those trusted parties that can host the service would be more difficult. Andre, do you agree or disagree?
Yeah, I do, actually. But I would say one of the things that I like to do is compare what we're doing in identity to payment networks. And so in the payment model, what's interesting is that we have 10 global payment brands. And the reason all 10 global payment brands exist is because they all serve their constituents in slightly different ways. Some try to be consumer focused, some try to be more merchant focused, some are geographically based, some try to span the transaction like Amex does. But they all are successful because they serve their constituents in slightly different ways. But what's interesting, however, is they all use the same chip, they all use the same form factor, they all use the same user ritual, they all use the same governance framework, and they all have this universal acceptance concept. Identity must work this way. So what keeps the global payment system safe is these three things. The first thing is we hit the complexity away from the user and we stuck it in the card. As a user, you don't have to train me on how to use the card because I get it, right? So we're not running around telling people, look for the lock, do the selfie scan, do the retina, whatever. We're not training users. And so this is really good. The second thing, the global payment scheme is a trusted network operator. As a crook, I can't pop up the middle and say, hey, I'm a crook, I take Visa, right? You have to apply to get in the network, and you have to behave well to stay in the network. And the third thing we've already touched on, when I lose my CIBC Visa card, I call CIBC right away because I notice it's not in my wallet. I call them not because I promised them they would. I don't care about them, they're nice and everything, but I care about me, the user. I'm terrified the crook's gonna spend my money and I have to pay. So this user self-interest is a critical ingredient in making global payments work. So let's bring this back to identity. We need to take those same three things and apply it to identity, but I would say this. Every economy in the world has the same three fundamental building blocks: bank, telco, government. The scheme we have built in Canada is designed to work globally. But in Canada, we have a bank-led scheme for the reasons Fatima just pointed out. But you still need telco and gov and others to complete the mission. In other economies, we may find we have a telco-led scheme, but you still need bank and gov. In other economies still, you may find that you need a gov-led scheme, but you still need bank and telco to fill it out. And so I think that's how identity is going to unfold.
Okay, so I just wanted to build off of something you said, Andre, which is that the complexity is sort of abstracted away from the user, right?
Right.
So Secure Key uses blockchain. Most companies, blockchain startups, which I don't consider you guys one of them, but most product companies that do use this technology advertise that as like first and foremost is sort of we're on the blockchain, we're using blockchain. And I think they do so to their detriment because it's a new term, it's not widely understood. And to your point, the more steps that I have to do that I'm not familiar with, the less likely I am to use this. So you've purposefully, I think, led with utility rather than technology, right? This is the usefulness of Verify Me, and that's why you should use it. So can you explain, though, beneath the surface, for the people here who are interested in the technology, what blockchain are you using? And how critical is it? What, I don't know if you can put a percentage on it, but like how much of what you do is dependent on this technology?
Yeah, so let me start there first, and then I'll fill in the rest of the answer. So I would say we are using blockchain, but it's an ingredient in our solution. It's not the recipe. And so it performs a very particular function. I've kind of touched on it a little bit. We need it for implementing our triple blind model. We need it for integrity proofs to make sure that the data is fresh every time it's presented. And so I want to just expand on this integrity point a little bit. If I'm going to consume data from a network as a service delivery organization, I have three requirements that need to be met. Requirement number one is I want to know the data came up from a known and authoritative source, somebody I would know and trust today. The bank would trust the province to provide a driver's license. The second requirement that needs to be met is they want to know the data has not been altered since it was written by that authoritative source. The crook didn't take my driver's license data, scratch out my photo, and stick their photo on it. And the third requirement that needs to be met is that we want to make sure the data is being presented by the person it belongs to. Our network is the only network in the world that can do this right now. Even at the counter, we can't meet all three of those requirements. We cannot tell if we're being presented fake data. When I go to the province and need to prove I've lived in the province for 6 months, I bring them 6 months of bank statements. And so they're getting paper. So clever users like me know how to Photoshop the document to make it say anything I want. So these integrity proofs can't even be met at the counter today. So what our service does is meets this integrity hurdle in a way that nobody else has before, but more importantly, it works for the consumer in person, it works for the consumer online, and it works for the consumer at the call center. Nobody talks about the call center, but it's one of the most critical service delivery elements out there. We have one telco in Canada, I'm not going to name them because it's not important, but they get 45,000 phone calls a month from consumers who can't remember the PIN to the account. And as you heard from Jack Dorsey, this is how his SIM card got taken away from him, because somebody called up and pretended to be him, and they social engineered the call center agent out of the PIN. And so he's a public figure. If he can't be protected in this model, how are the rest of us going to function, right?
Right.
So the three things we're getting out of blockchain is privacy model, like our triple blind model. It gives us integrity proofs. And the third side benefit is it gives us resiliency, which means it's much harder to mount a denial of service attack. And just to answer a question in the side window here, it is a decentralized network. Today in the real world, your identity is distributed. The bank has the bank data, the government has the government data, and the telco has the telco data, and so on across the economy. This model works the exact same way. It just gives you, the consumer, the power to share from A to B when you choose to, so you can get the new thing you want.
But Andre, can I, if I'm not a customer of one of the companies that's using Verified Me, can I bootstrap one of these things on my own? Like, is it permissionless, or do you have to sort of have a permission through a company that's connected to your network?
Yeah, great. So we run a private permissioned blockchain.
Yeah.
So what's good about that is getting to consensus is much easier, and we're not burning off all the electricity on the planet. So that's kind of cool. But to answer your question, you actually, with the model today, you have to have an anchor that's in the model already.
Right.
Today, the Canadian model is bank anchored. So you have to have a bank with one of the institutions. We have the big seven now, and we're working to get all of the financial institutions in Canada to participate so that this will work across the financial system, but more importantly, across the economy. And so that's the direct trajectory we're on.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to turn to Fatima here, but just to bounce off of something you said earlier. So you mentioned that with concierge, the cost of doing identity was very high, 970 million for 5 million Canadians. And in our research at the BRI, we've identified the cost of doing identity as one of the main reasons why cross-border payments are actually so expensive, which is that, especially for these small dollar values, like if it costs you hundreds of dollars to onboard a customer, you basically have to sort of socialize that cost over the payments that happen between banks in different parts of the world. And so what you end up seeing is, despite the fact that I can send a WhatsApp message, to someone in the Philippines instantaneously, if I want to send them money, it's going to cost me, upwards of 10% to do so, and it's going to be a system that's extremely antiquated. So the idea of this cheap, plentiful, abundant, ubiquitous identity that you described, I don't know if I added one more superlative there, but this idea that if everyone's using it, there's a potential social benefit as well, which is that it could lower barriers to financial inclusion, because identity is something that we can do much more easily. We can do the hard stuff online, as you described it. So CIBC is a bank that's got a lot of business in the Caribbean, Latin America, and elsewhere. Is this something today that's available to consumers across the banking platform, or in Canada?
So the way that we're pursuing a Verified Me implementation, it happened in two phases. Phase one was we set up the network, and there's a couple of digital identity consumer companies. So Sun Life is an example. Equifax is another example where you are able to use it. Us bank, we are working on phase two, which is implementing it in-house. So you are able to use it with our services as well. You'll see that in F20. And yes, we are talking to some of our locations that are across in the Caribbean and the US to see how they're able to also leverage this service or similar services as they look at their own infrastructure. One thing to mention, because you talked about global money transfer, and I just have to put in a pitch in there, we do have a global money transfer product here at CIBC where you can do things without a fee attached to it at real time. So.
Okay, good to know. I'm a CIBC customer.
All right.
I haven't heard about that. I had to, I hope that, well, anyway, I lost a bet to a friend who lives in Chicago, and I had to pay him. And I found out that I had to pay a $40 wire fee to get the money to him. So I paid him in Ether instead. Because it was just easier to use the blockchain. Okay, great. So let's talk about some of the bigger picture use cases for this. So the hardest of them all, I think, is democracy and voting. So people have been talking about e-voting for a long time. I know this because I used to be on the advisory board to Elections Canada, and I actually wrote an op-ed about it in the New York Times. But it turns out that the internet is actually not a great medium for voting, for many of the reasons that you two have already explained quite eloquently. It's not secure, and more importantly, it's important that when you vote, that your vote is cast, that it's cast for the person you voted for, and that it's counted, but that it's also counted only once, and that you can't vote again for someone else or for the same person. And it turns out the internet's not a great medium for that. And a big part of this is identity, which is that how do you, there's the old joke on the internet, nobody knows that you're a dog. On the internet, how do you know that you're a Canadian citizen and you say who you are, who you say you are? So it's a difficult problem to solve. I think there's a lot of potential. This has finally made it into mainstream politics. There are a couple of candidates in the United States, Andrew Yang, for example, who's now saying that blockchain-enabled digital voting is something that should be trialed and eventually rolled out. So let's talk about that example. Andre, you've got experience working with the federal government. Is this on their radar right now, and how do you see it playing out?
It is, but I'm not sure it's the place they want to start because, democracy is so vital to the trust we have in each other and our institutions in the country. The imperative to get it right is very, very high. One element of getting it right is getting the identity sorted out to make sure that everybody's entitled to vote and you only get to vote once. But the third thing is making sure you can't figure out how I voted, but still have auditability to know that everybody's vote got counted is a tricky problem, and paper does this really, really well.
Yeah.
But that's not a reason not to move forward. And so, to me, the one thing that needs to be figured out, and we don't have a good answer for, is we also want to make sure there isn't pressure being applied to people to vote in a particular way. And the way we solve this in person is by allowing you to go behind a curtain and you can cast your vote in public. And so if we put this on the internet, we have no way to know if, I don't know, I'm making this up now, union boss or your spouse or your neighbor or whatever is forcing you to vote a particular way. So we've got to make sure the social pressure element is figured out before we can do this well. But I do think we're on the right trajectory to make it happen, and I do think it'll get sorted out in time.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, people fall on both sides of the argument. Number one is that if you can, increase participation significantly, then you're making the outcome more legitimate. And the data says that the people who don't vote are typically, new immigrants or single moms or people who have to work two jobs. They're generally on the lower end of the income scale. And their voices, therefore, are underrepresented. On the other hand, yeah, it's possible that, there is no curtain in your house or on your plant floor or whatever it might be. And so there could be an influence. And I guess the question, this is more of a social question that we would have to debate as a country or as a civilization than as a technology question. But what's better? What are you prepared to make that trade-off in exchange for having greater participation in the democratic process? I don't know the answer to that. I generally fall on the side of I'm willing to take the risk if it means more people participate. And I think Canada is sort of an interesting country for that because we have communities of people. So there are 5 million Canadians that live outside of Canada. Other than New Zealand, it's the highest expat community living abroad of any G20 country. We also have these remote communities living in the high Arctic or in the prairies that don't really have ready access to polling stations. And those are people who are typically show lower participation rates, and could you make it easier for them to join into the process? And this is something that's sort of more topical today because the Supreme Court ruled in January of this year that Canadian expats who have been abroad for more than 5 years actually can vote because it is their democratic right.
I agree with you, Alex, and I think the way we get there is not start with voting out of the gate. I think we start with plebiscites to get greater civil engagement, to demonstrate the infrastructure works, and we can test for all the different accountabilities to make sure it functions the way we want it to, and then work towards getting to online elections. I agree, it's a place we have to get to.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Well, let's see. We've got about 10 minutes. I want to make sure we get questions here. So Anna asks, to get this across the economy, what role does government play? And then I think there was a question earlier that's sort of related. What's the strategy to incentivize users? So I'm a CIBC customer. Am I using Verify Me now, or do I have to sign up for it?
It depends. So as I kind of
Is
mentioned,
it
we're
like
still in the
is it a consumer-driven thing?
So I think the way we kind of look at it is it's a choice that we're providing, another means for you to provide your identity information. Today, if you are applying online and we are not able to validate you, we have to send you to the branch. Tomorrow, we can say you can go to the branch, or you can use Verify Me to provide your information, to provide your identity information, and you can complete it online. I think that's what we're trying to achieve, is give them that choice. And one of the things where we can actually get the adoption kind of going on is what are the most difficult transactions people may have today. And if we can get those enabled on Verified Me, I think you'll start seeing a lot more adoption. So I'm thinking things like, driver's license renewal, passport renewals, things that you're doing on the health side, or even transactions you're doing all the time. So if you're on Kijiji and you want to sell something, how do you know you're settling it to a real person? Like, those use cases to me is quite interesting, because it will really push that adoption level and giving people that choice matter as well.
Wouldn't the Holy Grail just for everyone to get automatically enrolled in this? I mean, as part of your online or mobile banking?
Today how it works is we are looking at other models, but right now there's an app for it. So you do have to download it. There's reasons for that. There's some security elements that will be stored within your device. We're limiting it to your device. And so there is an app for it. There are some use cases we're enabling that does not require the app through Webflow. So if you're on CIBC.com and you want to apply for a card, you don't necessarily have to download it. So we have to get the right mixture between security and convenience, and figure out, how do we actually get there.
I want to just pick up what Tina said and say it from a different point of view. If the Canadian government stood up and said, you must use your bank account to get to government, Canadians would be, what are you talking about? Right? There'd be outrage. And so,
well, there are some people who don't have access to bank accounts.
That's the second element too, actually, is we have to have universal access, not just people with bank accounts. So user choice in this whole thing is actually really critical to getting it right. But I want to kind of pick up on the two questions. And so the first thing I'd say on the topic of incentivizing users, I don't think that's really required. We've gotten to roughly 15 million Canadians using our service with zero advertising. The reason Canadians are doing this is because they want to make their online life easier.
I'm sorry, how many people?
Roughly 15 million across all of our online destinations at the provincial and federal level. There's roughly 15 million Canadians using the service already.
Right, so a little under half of the population.
Yeah, and there's 18 million online internet users according to StatsCan, so we're getting pretty up there. So that's the first thing. But what role does government play? So I talked about these three building blocks, and they're each here for a particular reason, because they each have something that the other two don't. So what the banks have is the critical and ongoing relationship. The one I care about more than any other online destination is my bank account, because of my self-interest. I want to make sure that's managed well, because if my money's gone, I don't want to be having to fight and go through a process to prove it wasn't me and so on. The telcos have a unique thing to bring here too. They have the one thing I'm willing to carry around. Like, getting people to carry around things is actually darn near impossible. Like, talk to the loyalty card folks, they'll tell you trying to get someone to carry a loyalty card is pretty much impossible. But I am willing to carry my driver's license. I will carry my credit card or debit card, and I will carry my cell phone. So the SIM card in the phone acts like the chip in the chip and pin model for a payment. It's the one unique thing only the real user could have and the crook could not possibly have. The government here actually has two roles. One is they can set the menu for the regulations and for standards for how this ought to work across the economy. But the second thing is they have the reference photo for the real Andre Boyson. If we started taking photos to get bank accounts, people are going to be, what? Don't want that experience. And the banks actually don't want it either. They want to deliver customer service. It's not about taking photos. So the problem, the fake driver's license attack, right? So if I start doing something that's really out of character to me, like I'm trying to transfer $10,000 from Bahamas to some place I've never talked to before, CIBC naturally is going to be on high alert. And so when they can actually get me to turn on my cell phone and verify my SIM card is in Bahamas, and I'm the one actually holding the phone, and that matches the one that came from the provincial's driver's license, they might have more comfort. And so it allows us to increase integrity. So each of these players has something unique the other two don't. More importantly, they each need what the others have, which is what a true ecosystem does. Mm-hmm. And when these three players cooperate, we can make a much bigger orchestra where other players can come in and make this work better.
So we've got a few more minutes. There's so much more I want to cover, but I'll try and be brief. So, Andre and Fatima, this is just as much for you as anyone else. You're not the only company out there that's trying to do digital ID, and there are other solutions. And Carlos here asks, Ontario has its own solution for digitizing driver's license. Other provinces have similar plans. Just more broadly speaking, on a global basis, there are lots of people trying to crack this nut. Some of the solutions, that are more blockchain focused are trying to be truly open-ended, sort of permissionless, anybody can join. And I think you've explained what some of the shortcomings of that are. But potentially one of the shortcomings of this model is that you've got different companies, different governments operating on in different silos, and you end up with this fragmented ecosystem. So how do you think about that moving forward?
I've already touched on it a little bit here, is that I think if identity is going to be successful, it has to function more like payments and operate with a global regime on common standards. And so that's thing one. Thing two is I don't think, I think we are onto a very good thing here in Canada, and the role that security plays, I think, is important in making this all work. But I don't think there's going to be one company that rules the world on identity. Like the payment system, I think we'll probably see 10 or 12 global identity companies that are working to a global standard, so we can make this work across the economy. But let me pick up on the question. Okay, Ontario has a digitized driver's license, Alex, and you're trying to send this money to your friend who has to pass a KYC check to make sure this isn't laundered money on his side. Please tell me how the bank in Chicago is supposed to understand how to consume this Ontario's driver's license. And by the way, has Chicago stood up a thing to allow you to do the same thing in reverse?
Yeah, I don't know. That's why there was a $40 wire fee, I guess.
Yeah, so it has to be done on global standards. And so we're on a mission to make this work globally. So job one is getting more destinations connected to the service so all of us can do more with our online identity. Job two is raising awareness with users about how this works, how it makes their life easier, and making it easier for consumers, at the same time harder for crooks to transact in their name. Job three is adding more sources of data, so you'll be able to have more control of what you're able to do online. So I can prove I'm a doctor or I'm a lawyer. I can bring in my credit check. I can bring in my background check because I want to be a volunteer at my kid's school. And job four is to make this a global standard.
Okay. So, Tina, you want to expand on that?
Sure. I think Audrey kind of touched on one thing that we think is quite important when we think about verified me and digital identity solutions. It kind of goes back to the example I was talking about earlier. With all these variety of digital identity types of services that are out there, it's more around how you actually implemented it that's more important. For us internally, I would like to see all these providers be on Verified Me's platform, to be a attribute provider within Verified Me so we can consume it in the right way. With the fragmented version of different types of solutions differently, it will be very challenging for us to get not just consumer adoption, but industries to actually deploy it. So that's kind of where my view is, so that I would like to actually see on Verified Me's platform that there can be providers within it.
Okay. So you mentioned the payment networks that exist today. So I guess, I don't know if this is an obvious question or not, but like, why wouldn't Visa or Amex develop this solution already, since it's already plugged into every financial institution and millions of merchants and hundreds of millions of consumers? Or are you just smarter than them and you got there first?
Well, they're running the business that they're running, and they're very good at it. I do note, though, however, they are starting to take a stronger interest in all of this. What I would say, however, is the challenge MasterCard has, or Visa for that matter, is they actually don't have any relationships directly with either side. We have acquirers that sign up merchants, and we have banks that sign up consumers.
Yeah. So
they're stuck in the middle, and they, in some ways, the problem they have is the exact same problem we have, is convincing the world to change.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, this has been an amazing discussion. We're out of time. I'd like to thank everyone who joined us on the call today for their engagement and for their questions and for taking the time. We really appreciate it. And this wouldn't have been possible without Fatima and Andre. That was a great discussion. I would say, and I've done a dozen or more of these things, probably the best webinar I think we've done so far. So there'll be a recording of this webinar, which will be available on our YouTube channel, and also will be distributed to members of the Blockchain Research Institute shortly after this call. We could keep going. Maybe we should do part 3 of the identity series. How about how about we touch base in 6 months and see where CIBC is at and where security is at, and we'll get everyone to join us again for this. Does that sound like a plan?
It does, actually. And so one of the things I want to add as an agenda item for that call is hit a patriotic note that we all need to solve, which is healthcare.
Yeah.
In this country, half the budgets are spent on healthcare, and we have a national imperative to get this sorted, and this digital identity infrastructure is going to be needed to do it. So let's add that to the next call.
Sounds great.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you both very much for your time. Yeah, thanks. Take care. This concludes the webinar.